A very warm welcome to this webinar in the seminar series SNS Sustainability Talks. And today we will focus on issues which relates to improving labor conditions in global supply chains. It is a great honor to welcome Professor Richard Locke. You will present your findings on how to promote fair and safe conditions in global supply chains. We're also very happy to welcome Sarah Negro, Global Public Affairs Senior Manager at H&M Group, and Ewerton Gruba, Director of Global Responsible Sourcing at Electrolux. And you will come in the panel discussion after the presentation of Professor Locke. My name is Mia Rantzien, and I'm the CEO of SNS. So let me now start to welcome Richard Locke into the screen. You are currently Provost of Brown University and Professor of Political Science and International and Public Affairs. You are a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and the ILO-IFC Better Work Program Advisory Committee. And from 2013 to 2016, you were the chair of the Apple Academic Advisory Board, which was a group of independent academics who worked with Apple to improve labor conditions in the company's suppliers. And we're very happy to welcome you back to SNS too. So with that said, before we start, as always at SNS, we want the audience to take part in the discussion. And at this occasion, you do that by using the Q&A function on your screen. And that will be later on in the later part of the seminar. But having said that, and without further ado, let's start. Professor Locke, the screen is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Mia, for that gracious introduction. And good evening, everyone. It's, I assume, late afternoon, evening for you. It's morning here in Providence. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to spend some time sharing some of the research that I've been doing with different groups of students over the last decade or two about issues related to global supply chains, which is once again a hot issue. I hope everyone is doing well. I hope that you and your family, your loved ones are staying safe and healthy during these very, very challenging times. And again, thank you for giving me this opportunity. So what I want to do in the time allotted to me this evening is to really talk to you a little bit about some of the research that I've been doing over the last several years. The research seeks to understand whether or not, and if so, how we can promote better economic competitiveness for firms at the same time as promoting social, labor, and environmental justice in today's globalized economy. Just the punchline, I believe that one can reconcile those two goals, that one can actually promote operational excellence and economic competitiveness, and at the same time promote a more just and environmentally sustainable economy. And the work that I'm going to describe is really motivated by sort of two concerns. The first is a more scientific concern. I'm a political scientist, a political economist by training. And what I'm trying to understand is, how does one regulate labor standards, environmental standards, health and safety standards in a globalized economy? We know how regulation worked in a more nation-centric economy, but how does it work in a world where just about everything that we buy is made from different components or materials, each of them manufactured in a different part of the world, then assembled in yet another part of the world, and then sold in yet another? How do we regulate that? So that's the sort of scientific question for me. But it's also a normative concern, which is how do we improve the day-to-day working conditions and living conditions for the millions and millions of workers scattered all over the world, but mostly in the global South, who produce the goods that you and I consume every day. What we know is that their conditions are not good. And so what can we do to improve those? So those are the two concerns. So this photo, I think everyone on this call probably recognized it. This was taken in April 2013 outside of the Rana Plaza factory complex in Bangladesh. As I think everyone on this call will recall, this was a terrible industrial accident in which over 1,000 young workers were killed when the building collapsed on them at the beginning of their work shift. And this is still actually the worst industrial accident that has been recorded in modern history. And the thing about this picture, now more than 8 years old, is that this accident was completely avoidable. That what we know is that the day before the building collapsed and killed the 1,200 workers, that there were serious cracks found in the foundations of this building, that the police knew about it, that the media knew about it, that the owners of the building knew about it, and the factories that were occupying the building knew about it, and the workers knew about it. But still, the next morning, notwithstanding that this had been actually broadcast in the news, and that people knew about it, the next morning, thousands of workers were kind of milling outside the building, trying to figure out whether should they go in or not. There were some of the factory managers with their security forces basically sort of coercing and nudging the workers to go into the building. And significant numbers of these workers felt that they didn't have a choice, that they could either maintain their job and their livelihood, and therefore risk their lives going into the building, or not risk their lives and lose their jobs. And they felt that they didn't have the choice. And as a result, shortly after the beginning of the shift, the building collapsed and killed them. Now, what is, this was a striking example of really, I think, poor business behavior. It's not lack of information. It's not lack of awareness. It's not, people knew what was going to happen, and it did happen. The sad thing is how this is not an unusual event. That while this is extreme, what we know is that explosions on factory floors, fires in the factories. The year before this happened, 24 workers that were working in a factory that assembles these kinds of goods, that they actually committed suicide because they felt the conditions were so terrible. What doesn't make the media, the press, so often are not these extreme examples, but the day-to-day small and often not so small injustices that workers experience every single day on either at work or on their way to work, whether that's harassment on the job or being paid wages that are below a living wage, or working conditions that are poor for their health, or working so many hours that their body begins to break down. This is, in fact, the common experience for the vast majority of workers who are producing the goods that you and I consume every day. And so the question for me, and I would hope for all of us on this call, is what can we do to remedy this situation? And so what I want to explain is that in the world that we live in, which is shaped by globally dispersed supply chains, so it's not, sometimes, at least in my country, some of the politicians have a very simplistic view. And that simplistic view is around globalization, that things used to be made over here, and now they're made somewhere else in some sort of exotic land in the global south, et cetera. And what we know is over the last 30, 40 years that production has been both fragmented and dispersed globally. And so goods like this one or like this one are actually made by many, many different components, each produced in a different country, assembled together in yet another country, often in the global south, and then sold mostly in the global north. And so in a world where production is so fragmented and globally dispersed, but where regulation still remains national in its focus, how does one regulate labor and health and safety standards? And so what has emerged And there's many people who have worked on this. In fact, there's one actually very significant scholar, Tim Bartley, who I understand is in Sweden, is in Stockholm, and is participating in this call, who has written extensively about this. And so what has emerged is a whole system of private voluntary regulation. And what that really means is that the buyers, the exporters, the importers, they basically impose a code of conduct on their suppliers, on the exporters. And the code of conduct is usually about the law of the land plus a few extra things. And what they do is they ask the producing suppliers to sign on to this code of conduct, saying that they will obey, comply with minimum labor standards, health standards, wages, working hours, working age, et cetera. These factories, these suppliers get audited periodically, either by private actors or by public NGO actors to make sure that they're in compliance with this code of conduct. And if they are, the system is supposed to work that the importers, the buyers, continue to place orders and buy from them. And if they don't, the argument is that they would no longer source from this. That's how this system works. And by the way, this is the dominant way that labor standards are regulated in today's global economy, an economy shaped by global supply chain. And this system developed in the early 1990s. Originally, it was focused on apparel and athletic footwear companies, but by this century, and certainly in recent in recent decades, it has actually expanded throughout the world in many different sectors, et cetera, including some of them represented in our call today. And so this is, again, the dominant way that labor standards are being governed in today's global economy. And so the question really is, how effective is it? Does the system really work? If so, how does it work? If it doesn't work, what else might work? And so that's what I want to talk about today. And so I was very fortunate to be able to work. I worked at MIT for 25 years as a professor there before coming to Brown University, where I have now been for 8.5 years. And I've been very fortunate to work with a wonderful group of students, both graduate students and undergraduate students from all over the world, who have an array of different skills, including language skills. And what we were able to do over these last 15 years or so is to convince global corporations, global buyers, to share with us their data. They share with us their audit data, these inspection reports, but also their sourcing data. Who are these suppliers? Where are they located? How big are they? How profitable are they? Et cetera. And so we collected these data from an array of different global buyers in very different sectors. And then we also did a lot of field research. We went and visited, this data is now old, I would say at this point it's about 200 different individual factories located mostly in the 10 largest exporting countries. And we did probably at this point about 1,000 interviews. So this study is really a series of studies that blended together quantitative data. We built the databases and also qualitative work. And what did we find? And I'm just going to give you the headline and then sort of give you some evidence for the first three of these findings. The first is that this whole system of private voluntary regulation, which is, again, as I want to repeat, is the dominant way labor standards are regulated in today's economy shaped by global supply chains, that it has impact, but it's limited. So it's better than nothing, but it does not lead to significant and sustained improvement over time. And I'm going to show you that. So this is really an important finding. The second thing is that there is a secondary model that we discovered when we were doing the research, which we call capability building. And if the first model on private voluntary regulation is really a kind of policing or compliance model, you agree to these standards, we're going to keep inspecting you to make sure that you're compliant with those standards. And if you aren't, we will offer you negative incentives. the capability building model is very different. And it assumes that many of the producers in the global south are, it's not that they're, amoral actors in these exotic lands, but they actually need help in developing their managerial and technical capabilities. And when one provides that help, when one builds up the capabilities, both managerial and technical capabilities among these suppliers, among these exporters, what one sees is not just improvement in their operations in terms of their productivity, their quality, their on-time delivery, but one also sees an improvement in their labor standards. In other words, those two things can go hand in hand. And so I'm going to show you some evidence on that. And then another thing that we did was to see that however, buyers actually can incentivize this by promoting a race to the top, by actually making sure that they are directing their orders to those factories that are actually investing in these capabilities and are more compliant as opposed to not. And I'm going to show you some data that shows that sometimes they do. And then I think an obvious fourth point, which I won't have time to talk about today, but I think it's very important, is that if we're serious about improving labor standards in today's global economy, that to do so requires work by both the public and the private sector. We still may be living in a world where there's a mismatch, where commerce is global, but regulation is still domestic. And yet we still, though, need state and private and nonprofit organizations to work together to solve this problem. So let me show you some evidence. And the first one is just, I'm going to go through this quickly and provide some data on the limits of private regulation. So the very first study that we did was on Nike. And we picked Nike because in many ways it was in the crucible of the whole anti-sweatshop movement, globally successful company, a leader in its sector, but that was the subject of many boycotts and protests, et cetera, because of labor conditions found in their suppliers. So Nike was able to share with us their data from their inspections, and we got them from 2001 to 2012. Now, they actually in 2005 updated the tool, so it's not a full series, but we wanted to show some of these data, and we analyzed these data. And just to give you a sense of it, we're talking about 900 different factories that they work with, located in 50 different countries, and we're talking about thousands and thousands of inspection reports that we were able to actually get the reports, code them, and analyze them. And there's different ways that they grade their suppliers. One way is a letter grade, which at least in the United States is how what we use in school. And so if you were graded an A, which means you're excellent, your performance is terrific, you're compliant with all standards. B would be, you're in good shape, you comply with most standards, there's room for improvement, et cetera. C is, a lot more room for improvement, but you have a good attitude. And D is like, really, we shouldn't be working with you. And what you can see in the series is that most of the suppliers are in the B or B minus range, which means that they're not all sweatshops, but they're not, great places either. And that what we would hope to see is over time improvements. But we see actually stagnation. And this is actually something that we see in almost every sector. Another study that we did was at Hewlett-Packard, and we picked Hewlett-Packard because if Nike was seen as, in many ways, a kind of poster child for the bad things having to do with globalization and labor standards, HP was seen as the opposite. HP was, at the time of the study and still today, one of the dominant producers of consumer electronics in the world. It has this company philosophy of the HP way, seen as being friendly to its workers, to the environment, to the community. And yet what we found is by studying 262 of their suppliers, which make over 80% of their product, And we found that of those, only 7 of their suppliers were fully compliant with their code of conduct, and most of them showed variation. And this is important. This table is basically to show you a couple things. First, if you look at the column that says facilities, you won't see 262. And that's because when you look at these inspection reports, not every single item is fully filled out. And that's because the inspectors often don't have the time to thoroughly investigate every item. That's an important thing. If you go to the last column, for simplicity, you'll see, well, are they compliant or not? And you'll see there's a tremendous amount of variation. So in terms of freely chosen employment, which means lack of slave labor, the vast majority of their suppliers are compliant. But if you go to look at things like working hours or emergency preparedness, or hazardous substances and how they're managing those, one sees that they're far from being fully compliant. And this is important. The same suppliers that were working for HP are the same suppliers that were producing and assembling those, where we know that there were explosions in the factory because they did not manage hazardous materials, that there were extensive violations of work hours, et cetera. And so what this shows us is, whether you're the good HP or the not so good Nike, whether you're in consumer electronics or athletic footwear, you have the same kinds of issues. And even if you're not a well-known brand, the issues are the same. And this is a company that we cannot, as part of our non-disclosure agreement, share the name of this company, but this is a large Hong Kong-based sourcing company. It actually sources product for large retailers like Walmart, Disney, big retail chains, both in the United States and in Western Europe. And we had hundreds of thousands of audits for them, over 10 cycles of audits. And they have a different scaling system from zero tolerance to satisfactory. But you can see that notwithstanding 10 cycles of audits, the vast majority of their suppliers are in between what they call immediate action and continuous improvement. And one doesn't really see a tremendous amount of change. So what this shows me, and we've shared this with the companies themselves, is that this model of private voluntary regulation, which companies are dedicated to, they spend a lot of resources to, they're trying their best to make work, but it seems it's better than nothing, but it's actually not leading to the results we want to see, which is significant, sustained improvements. And this is true regardless of brand, regardless of sector, regardless of country of origin, and regardless of company reputation. So I think that that's a really important finding. And the reason why I think that's important is because every time we have a Rana Plaza-like event, what you'll read in the press is, oh, what we have to do is make our system of inspection, compliance, auditing more rigorous, more transparent, et cetera. That probably will help, but it's actually not going to actually solve the issue. So what might? And this is what we discovered by doing the field research that we did while doing the research. So we didn't just collect data, we went in and visited factories. Well, because we had the data, we picked matched pair factories. So factories of roughly the same size, roughly the same age, making more or less the same products for the same brands, located in the same countries. But we had the data that showed that they had very different kinds of compliance outcomes, and we wanted to understand why. So this was one of those pairs. These were 2 factories located in Mexico, making more or less the same product for Nike, which are those kind of high-tech t-shirts that when you exercise, it flicks off the sweat. And what you'll see is Plant A pays higher wages than Plant B. That the work is a more modern work organization. Plant B is a more traditional bundle-like system. Plant A is a much more modular system. For truth of advertising, Plant A is owned by locals. Plant B is not. And notwithstanding that Plant A pays more than Plant B, they stay within the overtime limits, whereas Plant B doesn't. Now, what's interesting is that notwithstanding that plant A pays higher wages than plant B, and by the way, not higher minimum wages, because that's the same, it's productivity bonus. But what you can see if you look at the last two cells in this in the bottom lines of this table, you'll see that productivity is higher for workers in plant A than plant B, and unit costs are actually lower. So sometimes good things can go together. You can have more productive workers and better paid workers and stay within labor standards if you organize it together. And what we were able to see is that there was nothing inherent about Plant A than Plant B. Plant A used to have exactly the same production system that Plant B did and had the same kinds of issues. And so during our interviews with the managers of Plant A, we asked them, so what happened? Why did you change? And what they told us through these interviews was that they had been reading a trade magazine about lean manufacturing in the automobile industry and the aerospace industry. And so they asked their Nike contacts, do you know anything about lean? And Nike does know a lot about lean because they actually had a training facility for their footwear producers in Vietnam. And so they explained what they were doing. And so the Plant A managers asked them, could you help us? And so the Nike team started helping Plant A to reorganize their shop floor, to train their workers. They brought in some other consultants as well. Over time, it takes a while, but over time, what you saw was productivity enhancements in terms of both productivity and quality, but also an upskilling and an upgrading of the work and an improvement of the wages. And what Plant A did was not just give the workers and managers new technical and managerial skills, but also understood that during this process of change, where things inevitably are going to get worse before they would get better, they guaranteed them 83% of the prior productivity bonus to make sure that no one lost out. We found this example not just in garment producers in Mexico, we found it in sugar mills in Brazil, we found it in shoe producers in Vietnam, we found it in electronics producers in China. And so we started saying, look, there's this other model that seems to actually be delivering what we want, which is compliance with labor standards, but also better productivity and quality. And of course, all of you know that when you produce these kinds of findings to academics, people say, well, you know, that sounds really good. What a nice little story. But how do we know? Like, where's the real evidence? No one's going to, as they say in the United States, leave money on the table. And so we were able to convince Nike to allow us to study the rollout of this lean manufacturing process among their apparel suppliers, which is something that they did. And so what they allowed us to do is to study the 85 suppliers that decided to join this program, which was called the Lean Development Group. 85 out of their 587 garment suppliers. I just want to remind you, Nike has about 900 suppliers. The vast majority of them are actually in apparel. They're not in footwear or in equipment. And of those 587, we were able to study 85 of them distributed across these different countries and that had 800 different production lines. And what we wanted to do is actually look at the data of these 85 facilities 2 years before they engaged in their lean manufacturing and then studying them for at least 2 years afterwards. And we had data at the quarterly level. And the reason why we wanted to do this is because we wanted to avoid a selection bias study. Because you could imagine that maybe those suppliers that had decided to opt into this lean training program already had other things going for them. And so we were picking up something that's different from lean. And so we studied like what was the difference between them 2 years before, and there really wasn't. What this figure shows is that if the blue line crosses the dotted line that says 0, there's no statistical significance between those producers that are involved in the program and those that aren't. And what you see is that over time, and it takes more than a year and a half for this to happen, then you slowly but surely see the impact. And that's consistent with a lot of research on lean manufacturing, that it takes time and a lot of effort to sort of reorganize the shop floor and uptrain the workers for there to be an impact. But what this shows is that over time, a year and a half to 2 years, you have a significant growth, a shift of a whole grade from B to A or C to B, which is really, really significant. And this was the first time that there was a study that used company data in a systematic way to show the impact on lean, not just on throughput and quality, but also on labor standards. And as a result, Nike started changing their practices. So what this shows is that there is a way that actually does not cost more than the traditional compliance model to actually drive improvements on the shop floor to have both productivity improvements, on-time delivery improvements, quality improvements, as well as labor standards improvement. Maybe let me make one last point, and then I'll stop and we can open it up for discussion. So far, what I've talked about is interventions that can happen at the place of work, whether it's on the factory floor or in the farm, if we're talking about agriculture or things like that. But what we all know on this call is that to support that, one has to have positive incentives coming from the buyers, from the headquarters, to reinforce these things. And as we all know, there is an incredible debate out there that basically says that there's a race to the bottom, that there is no incentive for the buyers to actually buy from more compliant firms, because the assumption is more compliant firms are going to be more costly. And so in a world where we're often competing on cost, the incentive is to continue to place orders in the lowest cost producers. And those lowest cost producers are often non-compliant. That's the argument. There is an alternative argument, which says, actually, it's called the California effect, which is we could actually drive production in the more compliant producers if we actually incentivize it. And so what we wanted to do, and this was a paper that I did with a former student of mine, a wonderful, wonderful scholar named Greg Disselhurst, and we wanted to see which of these two producers these models worked. And so we wanted to understand, are there actually economic rewards? In other words, driving orders to the more compliant factories, compliant with labor standards. And by that, we meant basic labor standards, wages, working hours, health and safety in the global supply chains. And so what we were able to do is work with that sourcing agent. This is that company that I showed you earlier that's based in Hong Kong, that takes orders from retailers, mostly importing firms in Western Europe and the United States, and it places those orders in factories that either they own or they contract with in an array of different countries. And so using data from this sourcing company, so we had data from almost 6,000 factories located in 41 different countries for between 2009 and 2012. And we wanted to understand, is a company like this not known for social compliance, known for on-time delivery and cost leadership, how were they behaving? And here's just some sort of descriptive statistics about the data and the suppliers that we have. What it shows in the first one is, and we know this already, is that most of their suppliers are not in great compliance. It's C as opposed to a D. Most of their orders are not that great. It's between $500,000 and $1 million a year, but they actually perform quite well in terms of quality and on-time delivery. Now, who is buying from the sourcing company? And most of them are retailers. Most of them are in the garment sector, and most of it is in North America and Western Europe. So that's who is placing the orders to sourcing company. Very familiar brands. And who are the exporters? Where is production being made? Here are the factories located in those countries. They're in those countries because these are the largest producers of garments, but they're also known for not being especially respectful of labor rights. So this was the universe of suppliers and buyers that we were studying. And what we know is that most of the orders go to these countries that are not known for respecting labor rights or freedom of association. But what was really interesting for us is, notwithstanding most of the orders were going to those countries, if you actually looked at the factories within those countries, most of the orders were actually going to those factories that did respect the labor standards. So that was a really, really interesting finding, given that we're talking about a company, sourcing agent, that is not known for compliance, is known for cost leadership and on-time delivery and quality. And what we wanted to understand is make sure that they were placing orders not just in factories that had other things going on for them, but ones that really were paying attention to compliance. So we studied factories that were always in compliance. We studied factories that went out of compliance, that moved into compliance. And let me just conclude by saying what we were able to find is that incentive, let's place more orders in the compliant factories, actually held for compliance and not for other things. So just to wrap up, what I want to suggest is there's so much that we can do in the world of work to drive better labor standards. One is, of course, we should do the data collection, the traditional compliance model, private volunteer regulation assumes that we should do. We should collect that data, but data collection alone is not going to drive behavior. What we can do is, at the site of work, improve the capabilities of workers and managers to have more effective and more ethical workplaces. And in headquarters, we can make sure that we are driving the incentives by placing orders to those factories that actually want to improve the labor conditions. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take a question, and I'm going to stop sharing my slide.
Thank you very much for this extremely interesting research that we got to get an insight to. On that last note of the possibilities which are there, and how there was an article in the Financial Times earlier this year where your research was highlighted as a rare example of how it actually changed policies at multiple companies. In that sense, my question is, was that because of the quality of the research, and of course also the results as such and what they would bring with them? But did it also have to do with the way you actually connected to the real life in terms of working together with the companies, assembling data and other things, and also in your dissemination, connecting to unions and different organizations and other things?
Thank you, Mia, for that question. And I think why I'm so excited to be able to participate in today's seminar is because I think it's these kinds of opportunities where we're bringing together business leaders, academics, NGOs, et cetera, to actually engage in this kind of conversation and sharing the information. So I mentioned Professor Bartley's work earlier today. There's many, many people like me who are doing this work, and we're disseminating it in academic outlets, but also in non-academic outlets. And what we're trying to do is show the proof of concept, that there is an alternative. And many of the companies that I saw are joining on today's call are already doing that. And so I think what we have to do is continue to encourage. There's nothing special about what I do or my students do or something like that. I'm just one of many, many people working in this space, whether in the private sector, the NGO sector, or in the academy. But I think it's up to us to make sure that we're coming together, we're learning from what works and doesn't work, we're updating our practices and our information, and continue to try to diffuse that knowledge, because maybe it's my optimism in life, I think people want to do the right thing. I think we just have to show them how.
Thank you. One question here from the audience already. After that, I would like to invite our panelists. the first question is, what impact do you believe legislation can have on involvement on these matters and compliance? For example, the EU directive on mandatory human rights, environmental and good governance, due diligence for companies.
Yeah. That's a terrific question. And that was the fourth bullet that I wasn't able to get to. I think there's tremendous amount of leverage that, that the state, whether in our country, we have a federal system, individual states or the national government can do in terms of passing this legislation. I think what the EU has done has been really, really impressive in many, many different realms. In the United States, we see how individual states like California have passed certain legislation that's had a real impact, whether it's on environmental standards or on transparency and labor standards. Legislation isn't enough. We need enforcement. And many, many states don't have the capabilities or the resources, sometimes not even the will to enforce the laws on their books. So I think that's an issue that we have to pay attention to. But in the end, we need the state, but we also need the private sector to work with the state to be able to enforce these practices. Otherwise, it's going to be a cat and mouse game for a number of years.
Thank you. I now like to invite our two panelists into the screen and the discussion. So let me first ask Sarah Negro to join us with, and I will give you a question, just saying that you are, as I said, the Global Public Affairs Senior Management at H&M Group, and you join us from Hong Kong, which means that it's in the middle of the night, and we really appreciate that you're willing to do this. And you joined H&M in 2018, and before that you worked at the Chamber of Commerce and as a diplomat for Italy in Europe and in Asia. So a very warm welcome to you. We have now heard Professor Locke describe how Nike worked. And I would like to ask the first question to you. Your production chain spans also over many countries. And in your latest sustainability performance report, you write that you contribute to the employment of 1.56 million people. Can you describe how you try to promote better labor standards, including compensation and benefits in your supply chains? What is your focus and how is it going? What's the progress? Please, Sarah.
So first of all, thank you so much for having me. Indeed, it is night. I am in my kitchen because the baby is asleep on the other side. So I will keep it as quiet as I can tonight. But thank you again for having me. And thank you for the question, which is absolutely relevant to the work we do in H&M. So I will probably state the obvious here, but I completely agree with Professor Locke. We have also realized over time that we have a lot of limitations when it comes to simply working with compliance, which is the word we use to define private regulations. We call it compliance in H&M. And we have started doing compliance very early at the beginning of the 90s. And our code of conduct was probably one of the first that was really published and used in the industry. But soon enough, we discovered all of the limitations that come with that, and the fact that, for instance, as Professor Locke was saying, negative incentives might work, but only up to a certain point. And that's why we progressively introduced new components in our strategy. We didn't leave behind the code of conduct. That, of course, remains. It's a solid stepping stone for us. But since 2013, we started really the capacity building or the capability building. And what has been our focus? Because you are asking about compensation, and definitely I want to get to that point. Our focus has been mostly working on two different components. The first one, the social dialogue, seen as the very basis for having a proper dialogue within the factory between the management and the workers. And we have done extensive trainings covering a huge quantity of our tier 1 suppliers all across the different markets we operate in. And the second program we have started soon after has been around wages, and it is called Wage Management System. Is a system of training defined to create differentiation of the wages within the workers of the same factory, so that it's not anymore that everyone is paid at the minimum wage, but we create differentiation, we create opportunity for growth, career growth, and also for rewarding productivity and performance. And we've done this since 2013. And now in 2018, after quite some time we were doing this, we started wonder, what is the impact? We see progress. I mean, we see more and more factories being enrolled in these programs, but can we measure actually the impact of what we are doing? And this question was a very hard one, because we realized that we needed so many data in order for us to really have a solid methodology in order to assess impact. And this is why we decided to ask for some help. And we have asked help to one professor that has been already mentioned tonight, Gregory Disteldorst, who together with Jiun Shin has been working with us for many months in order to look into our data and try to make sense of what was the impact of our interventions. And I think that the most interesting part that we have found out is that the simple fact of the factories joining our programs had a real impact on wages paid. This impact has been measured according to this statistical method as a 2.7% increase on wages in real terms one time. So once the factory was actually fully enrolled in the program. But when the program was carried out to this utmost expansion, so when also the wage grid, a system of classification of the different jobs in the factory, was actually introduced by the management, the increase of wages was much more considerable, and on average 5%. We have studied much more than that because we didn't have enough. We explored our purchasing practices. We wanted to know how much they actually mattered. You might all know that purchasing practices has been really at the center of the public debate. Suppliers have pushed this topic in the agenda, and rightly so. There is very credible studies made from the ILO and ETI, for instance, the latest one in 2017 that shows the negative impact of bad purchasing practices on worker conditions. So we studied that, but especially we studied efficiency, or what probably I think Professor Locke has called as productivity and lean management. We have slightly different terminology, but that's what it is. And we have found out a very strong connections between efficiency and, again, wages increases, to the point that according to the study, which will be published soon, and our name will be on it, so you will realize which study it is for sure, there is a connection between a 10% increase in efficiency and a 4.6% increase in wages. So this is, to me, really important and shows how different type of interventions can really have an impact. Now, data collection has been key, and I think we are one of the companies that is collecting the most data, especially when it comes to wages. You might realize it's a very sensitive information to us, to our factories. It means there is some sort of trust, a long-term relationship between us and the suppliers for them to feel comfortable in sharing this data. And I think two maybe very short concluding points, because I don't want to take too much of your time, of course, but I want to say that when we talk about incentives and positive incentives, absolutely, a key point, create positive incentives for the suppliers. We do that through the supplier relationship management, a system we have in place where sustainability and the achievement of a certain level of performance in sustainability is actually compensated with more business, better business, and long-term planning with us. And finally, a last point on the public regulations. I feel that maybe we have reached some of the limits we can go to as private actors. Definitely, if we really want to change and lead the change and make a very meaningful growth in these economies and these countries, we need private regulations to be combined with public regulations. And this is why we're making an effort for advocacy, for public affairs. We welcome many of the European Union initiatives in this regard, but we also want to take this dialogue and this debate with the government of the countries we produce in to tackle topics like minimum wage, social protections that are very important and so much dominated by the legislation that is very difficult for private companies directly impact on those without that dialogue to be open with the governments. So all in all, these are my probably my most interesting points. But again, I am very happy to take any other question you might have, because certainly not everything is positive. I have highlighted, of course, the best part of the work we do. This doesn't mean we are without challenges, without learnings, without failures. So we are really here to learn, to be inspired, to do more and to do better.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that interesting insight to how you work and all the details of the amount of work you're doing in learning more and also to improve conditions. I want to use the time, as we don't have that much time left, to actually now move on to our next panelist, Ewerton Gruba. Please join us on the screen. You are the Director of Global Responsible Sourcing at Electrolux, and you have a long experience from global companies from different sectors with responsible sourcing and social and environmental accountability. And you join us from Electrolux office in Charlotte, North Carolina in the US. Yeah. So, hi and welcome. So let me now ask you, you are also a company with a large number of suppliers in your production at Electrolux. And can you give a little bit of insight how you go about your due diligence on new suppliers, and also how you monitor your existing supplier base? What is the trend in your results? Please.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me here today. It's very a great learning and a great pleasure to hear from Professor Locke and Sarah Negro on what is going on both sides in the academic and also on the business area. So, I share, and I'm happy to hear what the conclusions that Professor Locke have come out with his research, because what we see when you look at the due diligence, this is just a small part of a bigger process, right? For instance, at Electrolux, when we are looking at within the responsible sourcing program, right? So we have a very holistic approach when we work with our supplier base. So as you said, we have a huge number of suppliers in all the countries that you can imagine, with different backgrounds, with different processes. So the due diligence, it's just one small piece of this big puzzle. The first thing that we need to work, and within Electrolux, responsible sourcing respond directly to the global sustainability team in Stockholm. But we work very closely with purchasing, right? So we do not report to purchasing to avoid any kind of business conflict, right? But we work close to them because we need to understand their supply chain. And as that said, the first thing that we need to do, and we have done this over the years, so we need to map and understand our supply chain, what kind of suppliers we have. So we perform a kind of risk assessment where we map all the elements that allowed us to drive conclusion on the sort of suppliers that we have. And of course, we start to narrow down to those that we understand that could be critical for our business or represent a risk, or when it comes to labor standards, human rights, health and safety, environmental. So all these elements, it's considered in our evaluation. And then we understand that we need to also do in the field work, which basically it's go there and visit and do the due diligence. But the main point here, and this is why Electrolux, the vast majority of the on-site audits that we do, it's not with a third party, it's with our own resource. Why? Because we have a slightly different approach. When you just audit the supplier, you go there and take a picture. When you do the assessment, you go there and see where are the opportunities or the risk, and how we can, together with the supplier, show them that, hey guys, you have all these points here that could represent a risk, not only for our business, but also for yours. So what we recommend, and we have a big team and a huge knowledge that we can share with you to help you to develop. And this is our ultimate goal, to support our suppliers to improve over time, right? So we share with them. So we are creating like a library for our suppliers where we share best practices from our own operations, right? And then we start to work with them. And the other important element is working with purchasing. We fully agree with the point that Professor Locke said, that we need to provide incentives to suppliers, right? We need to show them that it's good for business to not only to be in compliance, because being compliance, we set a minimum level, but how to go beyond compliance. And this is the key, because if you see our targets as a company go much beyond the compliance itself. So we need, how can we drive this in the supply chain? And this is why we work with purchasing, and purchasing has, at Electrolux, has a very clear understanding on that, because the way that we are going to improve suppliers, not only on the social side, but also on the quality side, on the R&D side, it's work with the suppliers that we are going to have long-term agreements, suppliers that will share the same ambition that we have, right? So, and then we start to narrow down. And when we start to narrow down, that is quite interesting, because the suppliers come to us and say, hey, I need to improve. I want to be your A suppliers. How can I be part of this? Because I know that I can earn more business. So how can we work on that? And then you see, it's where you see the change happening, right? Because it's between the stick and the carrot, right? The stick, you can punch them a couple of times, but they will not improve that much. But when you show the carrot, they will take this change inside their company and understand that, hey, we need to change inside to get the price that our customers are requiring. And you see this, we have suppliers that come to us that say, hey, when I reach our highest level here, how can I get a recognition to share with other customers? Right? How can, because this helped me to promote my business and I want to do better. So this is the entire environment that we believe this is how we can drive the improvement in our supply chain and make it better.
Thank you very much for that insight into how you work. Actually, we are coming to the end of the webinar, but I would like to ask one final, very short question, and I put this to Professor Locke. And data, the importance of data is obvious from your work and also from we've heard from our companies. The question that came was, will the possibilities to actually use real-time data through new technology platforms be possible in the future to even make us know more what works and what does not work on these issues?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was wonderful to hear from both Sarah and Ewerton about the work that they're doing. And I think that we're moving from a world where it was sharing anecdotes and stories, often a firefighting model, like, oh, there's a terrible thing, let's put out that fire, to then what Greg and me and Tim and others have done is collect data and try to analyze it. And now with the data revolution that we're experiencing, we have access to real-time data. And I think that's great for academics, because then we can analyze it. We usually have the time to do it in a way that business practitioners don't. And I think the partnership that Sarah was describing, which I thought was great, that hopefully Ewerton and Electrolux engage in, is really, really important. we need to work together to bring about the changes that we want. And I think, as Sarah said, not everything's rosy, but slowly but surely we'll get there. I unfortunately have to put on my provost hat now and go to a dean's meeting, but it was really, really wonderful to see you all. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Richard. And the discussion will continue. Please feel free to go. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And by that, I'd also want to thank Sarah and Ewerton for being part of this and giving so much insight, and also for the questions coming from the audience. We will come back to the issues. We will continue SNS Sustainability Talk. And we hope to, after Christmas, after New Year, we will have Caroline Rees, President and co-founder of SHIFT, the international leading center of expertise of the UN guiding principles of business and human rights here to talk on those issues. So thank you all, and I hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Bye.
My pleasure.